There is a question that has been argued in spaceport cantinas and mercenary barracks and quiet corners of the galaxy for as long as anyone has bothered to keep records. And somehow, it has never once been settled. Who was the most dangerous bounty hunter who ever lived? Not the fastest draw, not the loudest name on a wanted board. The most dangerous. The one you would least want to learn had taken your name and put it in a file and started walking toward you. Tonight, we are going to settle it. So get comfortable. Turn the lights down as low as they will go. There is no hurry in what follows, and nothing here needs you to stay awake for it. This is a long story, and it stretches across most of a century. And it begins in the rain on a planet that officially did not exist. And it ends somewhere far stranger than that. You can drift off wherever you like. The story will still be going when you come back. But before we can crown anyone, we have to agree on what the question actually means. Because most people who argue about it are not arguing about the same thing at all. Dangerous is a slippery word in a galaxy that contains sorcerers who can crush a starship's engines with a thought. If dangerous simply means capable of violence, then the answer is boring. Because the answer is a Sith Lord, and it always will be. No bounty hunter who ever lived could stand in an open field against a fully trained dark side adept and expect to walk away. That is not a contest. That is a weather event. So dangerous has to mean something more specific than that. And here is what it means. A bounty hunter is dangerous in proportion to how reliably they finish. Not how hard they hit, how reliably they finish. The galaxy is full of killers. What it is short of are people who can be handed an impossible name, given no support, no legal authority, no backup, no forgiveness if they fail, and who will simply go out into the dark and come back with the target again and again for decades against enemies who had every advantage and who will still be breathing at the end of it when every single one of their rivals is dead. That last part matters more than anything else. And we will come back to it because it is the whole argument. The graveyard of this profession is enormous. It is stacked with people who were faster, stronger, better armed, better connected, more feared in their moment. And they are all in it. Every last one of them. There is exactly one exception. And that exception is the story we are telling. But let us be fair about it first. Let us walk the field properly, because a crown handed out without looking at the competition is not worth anything at all. And the competition here was genuinely terrifying. Start with the one most people reach for first, because for a few short years he was untouchable, and because he did things nobody else on this list ever managed. He was tall and thin and blue-skinned, with red eyes sunk deep under a wide-brimmed hat. And he spoke slowly, in a dry, rasping drawl, as though every conversation was costing him money. Cad Bane came out of a species that had been raised in a culture of hunters, and he took that instinct and stripped every trace of honor off it until only the efficiency was left. He worked during the years when the galaxy tore itself apart in civil war, when the Jedi Order was at the peak of its numbers and its reach, when thousands of trained Force users were spread across every sector with a mandate to keep order, and Cad Bane hunted them. Understand how strange that is. Most professionals in his line of work spent their entire careers arranging their lives so that they would never have to be in the same room as a Jedi. Bane arranged his life so that he could be. He built his equipment around it. He wore gauntlets that fired grappling lines and flamethrowers and stun charges. boots that let him rise off the ground just far enough to break a pursuit, and he carried devices specifically designed to strip a Force user of the one advantage that made them untouchable. He studied how they fought. He studied how they thought, which was the more useful study, because the way they thought had a hole in it. They were guardians. They protected, which meant that if you could put something they loved in front of them and threaten it, you could make them do almost anything. And Bane worked out very early that a hostage was a better weapon than a blaster. He proved it in the most spectacular way anyone in the profession ever has. He walked into the seat of galactic government, the most heavily defended building on the most heavily defended world in the galaxy, took the entire legislature hostage in a single coordinated strike with a handful of hired guns, and used them as leverage to force the release of a prisoner the Republic would never have released under any other circumstance. And then he walked back out. He did not fight his way out. He did not need to. He had made himself impossible to attack by standing behind several hundred senators, and the people trying to stop him were, by their own code, unable to accept the losses that stopping him would have cost. He did more than that. He broke into the Jedi Temple itself, which was supposed to be the single most secure structure in the Republic, and he took what he had come for. He captured Jedi and held them. He tortured a Jedi Master, calmly, methodically, without any particular pleasure in it, treating it as a technical problem to be solved. He killed. He did all of it for money. And he was very clear that it was for money, and he never once pretended otherwise. For a stretch of a few years, Cad Bane was the most feared professional alive. And if the question were, who was the most dangerous bounty hunter of that particular decade, the answer might well be him, and there would be a real argument to have about it. But hold that thought, because the decade ended, and Cad Bane's career ended with it, and we will come back to exactly how. Then there is the woman, pale as bone, tall and narrow, with a shaved skull except for one long braid and a slim antenna implanted into the side of her head. Aurra Sing was possibly the strangest figure the profession ever produced, and certainly the most personally malicious. Where Bane was a professional who happened to hunt Jedi because that was where the money was, Sing hunted them because she wanted to. She collected their weapons. She kept them hanging from her belt like a set of trophies. And there were a great many of them. The reason she was so good at it was that she had been trained by them. That is the part of her story that most people miss. Aurra Sing was Force sensitive. She had been found as a child and brought into the Jedi Order and taught, at least for a time, in the same halls as the people she would later spend her life killing. She left. The stories about how and why she left never quite agreed with one another, and she never bothered to correct them. But she left with a working understanding of how the Order thought, how it trained, what it taught its students to expect from an enemy, and what it taught them to dismiss. And she spent the rest of her life exploiting that knowledge with an enthusiasm that unsettled even other bounty hunters. She was a marksman above everything else. Not a duelist, not a brawler, though she could do both. A shooter. She preferred to end a hunt from a great distance, from a rooftop or a ridgeline, before the target ever knew a hunt was happening. She was patient in a way that most violent people are not, capable of lying still for hours. And she had no interest whatsoever in a fair fight, which is an attitude that keeps a person alive far longer than courage does. She was also and this is worth saying plainly, cruel. Bane killed because a job required it. Singh killed and then arranged the aftermath so that it would hurt somebody. She took students and used them. She made promises she had no intention of keeping. She was the kind of dangerous that does not simply threaten your life, but leaves a wound in whoever survives you. And her career also ended. We will come back to that too. Then there are the ones who were dangerous in a much simpler way, because they were simply very difficult to kill. Bossk was a Trandoshan, which meant he was a walking wall of scaled muscle with a mouth full of teeth and claws that could open a Durasteel hatch given enough time and irritation. His species regenerated, not perfectly and not quickly, but a Trandoshan who lost a limb could grow it back, and a Trandoshan who took a wound that would have finished any human simply kept coming at you while it healed. Their culture was built around hunting, around the belief that the taking of prey earned favor from a goddess who counted every kill. And that belief made them relentless in a way that had nothing to do with money. Bossk hunted Wookiees, mostly in the early part of his career, and hunted them badly enough that he became a name in the slaving trade. He carried a mortar launcher because subtlety did not interest him. He flew a heavy, modified freighter that could take punishment no fighter could survive. He had a temper that got him into trouble constantly, and a constitution that got him out of it. He was a bad tactician and an appalling planner, and he was still, decade after decade, a genuinely lethal problem, because you could shoot him and he would still be there. He is on this list because of what he outlasted, not because of what he achieved. And he is not the answer, though he came closer to the end of the story than most. Then there was the machine, IG-88 was an assassin droid. And to understand why that was terrifying, you have to understand what he was built to be and what he became instead. He was designed as a security unit, tall and thin and skeletal, a column of servos and armor plating with a cylindrical head and a photoreceptor band that gave nothing away because there was nothing there to give. Within moments of activation, he had assessed his situation, concluded that his creators were a threat, and killed every one of them in the room. Then he walked out. What made him dangerous was not the arsenal built into his frame, although the arsenal was substantial. It was that he did not stop. He did not eat. He did not tire. He did not lose his nerve or get bored or take a job that paid better halfway through a hunt. He did not have a family that could be threatened. He would pursue a target through a nebula for a year if the calculation supported it. And the calculation usually did. Organic hunters had to sleep. IG-88 spent those hours closing distance. And there were more than one of him, which is a detail that unsettles people the first time they hear it. Several units were built from the same template, and several of them survived. And they networked, and they shared what they learned. Kill one, and you had not solved the problem. You had informed it. Whether IG-88 ever had ambitions beyond the work is a question the galaxy argued about for a long time afterward, and the answers ranged from the plausible to the frankly apocalyptic. Some said he was working towards something much larger than any bounty, a droid uprising, a mind copied into something enormous. Others said that was a story invented after the fact by people who wanted a tidier explanation for a machine that simply would not stop. Either way, he was on every serious list of the most dangerous professionals in the galaxy. And he earned the place. Then there was the thing that should not have been possible. Dirge was old. Not old the way people are old, old the way ruins are old. He had been born into a species of warriors who healed from wounds that should have been final, whose bodies could pull themselves back together from damage that would have scattered anyone else. And he had lived through so many centuries that the galaxy he had grown up in was a matter of dusty historical record by the time he was still out there working. The Mandalorians had captured him once, in the deep past, when he had made himself their enemy. They did not manage to kill him. Nobody managed to kill him. So instead they took him apart, slowly, over a very long time, in ways that are not pleasant to describe, and they entombed what was left, and they left it, and it healed, and it waited, and it remembered. When it got out, it had exactly one interest, and that interest was Mandalorians. Dirge fought during the Great Civil War as a killer for hire, encased in heavy armor that hid a body which was no longer really a body at all. And the things he survived on those battlefields became legend. He was crushed. He was burned. He was cut apart. He kept getting up. There is a well-known account of him being torn open by a Jedi at the height of his powers and simply flowing back together. And if that account is exaggerated, it is not exaggerated by much, because everyone who fought him told a version of the same story. He is not the answer either. And the reason he is not the answer is the most instructive thing on this entire list. Dirge was almost unkillable, and he was still not the most dangerous. Because dangerous is not the same as durable. Dirge could not be stopped, but he could be predicted. He hated what he hated, and he went at it directly, and anyone who understood that could steer him. A weapon you can aim is a weapon your enemy can also aim. Then there were the professionals who never quite reached the top tier, but who deserve their mention, because the field was deep. Zam Wesell was a shapeshifter, a Clawdite, and she worked by becoming other people, not disguise, actual physical change, bone and skin rearranging, which meant that the person walking past you in a corridor might be the person hunting you, and you would have no way of knowing until the moment it stopped mattering. She was good. She was very good. She was also, in the end, expendable to the people who hired her, and she found that out in the worst possible way. Dengar was a human who had once been something else entirely, a young man with a life and a rival and a grudge, until a crash took most of his skull away, and the Empire rebuilt what was left. They took things out while they were in there. Some of the parts that let a person hesitate. He came out of that surgery capable and cold and permanently in pain, wrapped in bandages that never fully came off, carrying a rifle and a hatred that had been surgically sharpened into a career. He was competent for a very long time. He was never quite first rank, but he lasted, and lasting counts for something in this profession. And there is a reason he appears again later in this story, in a way you might not expect. Embo was quiet and enormously skilled, and used a hat as a weapon, which sounds absurd until you have seen what a hardened brim thrown at speed does to a person. Sugi and Rumi Paramita and Latsratsi and Heisinger and a dozen others rotated through crews and jobs across those years. Some of them were formidable. Most of them are footnotes. And then there is the one who is not a footnote at all, and who has to be handled separately, because he is not really a rival. He is the beginning. Jango Fett was, by common agreement in his own era, the finest bounty hunter alive. Not the most feared, because he did not court fear. The finest. There is a difference, and the difference is the whole point of him. Where Bane advertised, and Singh collected trophies, Django worked. He took the job. He did the job. He took payment. He left. He wore blue and silver Mandalorian armor that had been through more engagements than most warships. He flew a battered patrol craft he had taken off a man he had killed. He had a reputation so solid that a Sith Lord, looking for the single best physical specimen in the galaxy, the man whose body would be copied to build an army, went directly to him and did not bother interviewing anybody else. And that is the moment where our real story begins. Because Jango Fett asked for something in return. He did not ask only for money, although he asked for a great deal of money. He asked for a son, not a soldier, not a copy that would be conditioned and accelerated and sent off to die on a planet he had never heard of. One clone out of millions, left exactly as he was. No genetic modification for docility, no accelerated growth, unaltered. His to keep, to raise, to teach. They gave him one, and that child was named Boba Fett. So now we go to the Rain. The planet was called Kamino, and if you went looking for it on a standard chart, you would not find it, because it had been quietly and deliberately erased from the archives by someone who did not want it found. It sat out past the edge of the galactic disk, isolated, surrounded by nothing, a world with no landmass left at all. There had been continents once. The seas had risen and taken them, and the people who lived there had responded not by leaving but by building upward, raising vast white cities on stilts that stood in open ocean while the storms rolled over them, and the storms never stopped. That is the thing everyone remembers about Kamino. The permanent gray, the wind coming in flat across an endless swell, the rain hammering the windows day and night, without any real change between them. It was not a hostile world exactly. It was an indifferent one. It did not care whether you were there. The people who lived there were tall and pale and long-necked, graceful in a way that was somehow more unsettling than aggression would have been, and they spoke softly and moved slowly and had spent generations refining a single science to a degree nobody else in the galaxy had matched. They grew people. They had done it first to save themselves. When the flooding came and their own gene pool narrowed and the species faced an ending, and having saved themselves, they discovered that the skill they had developed was worth a fortune to anybody who wanted an army and did not want to explain where it had come from. Into those cities, one gray afternoon, like every other gray afternoon, came a man in blue armor and a very small boy. Boba Fett spent his entire childhood in that place. Try to imagine it properly, because it explains a great deal about who he became. Endless white corridors, lit evenly, no shadows anywhere. Rain on transparent steel. Long galleries where thousands of identical bodies floated in amber fluid, and further along, thousands more, standing in perfect ranks, learning to march. Children who wore his face. Older boys who wore his face. Men who wore his face, and who were, by any honest measure, his brothers, and who were being manufactured to be spent. He was not one of them, and everybody made sure he knew it. They were product. He was family. That distinction was the entire architecture of his childhood, and it did two things to him simultaneously. It made him proud, because he was singular in a place full of copies, and it made him profoundly alone, because the only other person in the galaxy who was not a copy was his father, and his father was frequently away. The Kaminoans were kind to him in their own remote fashion. One of them in particular, a scientist who oversaw the project, seems to have felt something like genuine affection for the boy, and she looked after him in the gaps when Django was off-world. But affection from a Kaminoan was not warmth. It was attentiveness. It was the care you give something valuable. His father was another matter, and here we should be careful, because the easy version of this story makes Django Fett cold, and the evidence does not support it. Django Fett loved his son. Everything we know about how he arranged his life says so. He had negotiated the boy's existence as the price of the largest contract of his career. He kept him close. He took him off-world with him rather than leaving him in the cities. He taught him constantly, in the way that men who are not comfortable with words teach, which is by showing how to strip a weapon and clean it and put it back together in the dark, how to fly, how to read a docking bay before walking into it, where the exits were, who was watching, who was pretending not to, how to sit still and pay attention to a conversation happening across a room, how to lose an argument on purpose so that the other person stops looking at you. He did not teach him cruelty. That is a common misreading. Django Fett was not cruel, and he did not raise a cruel child. What he taught was something colder and more durable than cruelty, which was self-reliance. Nobody is coming. That was the lesson under all the other lessons. Nobody is coming to help you, so be the kind of person who does not need helping. The ship they flew was called Slave One, and it deserves its own moment, because that ship is going to appear in this story for the next 60 years, and it was as much a member of the family as anything else. It was ugly, genuinely ugly, in a way that made experienced pilots laugh the first time they saw it, which is a mistake most of them only made once. It was a patrol craft of a design that had been out of fashion for decades, shaped like a flat iron or a teardrop laid on its side, and it flew in an orientation that made no sense to anybody watching. The cockpit rotated so that the pilot stayed upright while the hull turned. In atmosphere, it stood on its tail like a tower. In space, it lay flat, and Django had spent years making it into something monstrous. Under those unlovely plates were sensor jammers and a tractor beam and concealed weapon mounts, ion cannons, laser cannons, a seismic charge launcher that could crack a small asteroid, missiles, mines that could be dropped in a pursuit lane. It had holding cells in the belly, 6 of them, because a hunter who could only carry one target at a time was throwing money away. It could take punishment that would have gutted a fighter, and it could still run down almost anything smaller than itself. The boy grew up in that ship. He learned the sound the engines made when something was wrong. He slept in the crew space while his father worked. He was there when jobs went well and there when jobs went badly. And he was old enough to understand the difference. And then there was a day when a man came to Kamino asking questions. He was a Jedi, and he was polite, and he was extremely good at his job. And his arrival in those white corridors was the hinge on which the entire life of Boba Fett turned. Although nobody in the room understood that at the time, the Kaminoans, believing the Republic already knew everything, showed him the whole operation with pride. The tanks, the ranks, the scale of it. And then, because there was no reason not to, they took him to meet the man the army had been copied from. Boba was in the room when the Jedi came in. It is worth slowing down here, because this scene is small and quiet, and it is the single most important few minutes in the story we are telling. There was no violence in it. A man in armor and a man in robes stood in a modest set of quarters and talked around each other, both of them lying, both of them aware the other was lying, both of them being extremely careful. Old scars were mentioned without being explained. A ship was mentioned without being explained. And a boy of about 10 stood off to the side and watched his father handle a threat with nothing but his voice. Then the Jedi left. And Jango turned to his son and said, in effect, that they were leaving too, right now. And the boy did what he had been raised to do, which was to move without asking why. He never got a real childhood after that. He barely had one before. What followed was a chase, and then a landing on a red world of stone and dust, and vast underground hives, and then a series of events that happened much too quickly for a child to process. There was a war beginning, not a small war. The largest war the galaxy had seen in 1,000 years, and it was starting that afternoon, in an arena carved into rock, in front of a crowd. The boy was in the stands. Try to hold on to that image, because it is the one that explains everything that comes afterward. He was not hiding. He was not somewhere safe. He was seated in a box beside the men who were running the war, watching the field below fill with soldiers who had his father's face, and hearing the noise of 100,000 insectoid spectators. And in the middle of all of it, his father went down onto the sand. There was a Jedi on that sand who was, at that particular moment, one of the most formidable fighters alive. What happened between them took a few seconds. Jango Fett had spent his entire life training for exactly that kind of encounter, and he was better at it than almost anyone. And it did not matter, because the arithmetic of that fight was never in his favor, and he probably knew it when he committed to it. The boy watched his father die. Then he went down onto the sand afterward, into the dust and the noise and the wreckage of a battle that was still going on around him. And he found the helmet. It had come off. It had rolled. He picked it up and he knelt there holding it. This small figure in an enormous arena full of dying people, holding a piece of scorched blue and silver plating that still had the shape of a head in it. That is where the most dangerous bounty hunter in the history of the galaxy was made. Not in a training program, not in a war. In a few seconds of noise, at about 10 years old, on his knees in the dirt. Nobody came for him. That was the lesson his father had taught him. And the galaxy confirmed it on the same day it took him. Nobody came. There was no relative to take him in. There was no institution that would notice. There were several million soldiers walking around the galaxy wearing his exact face. And not one of them was his brother in any way that helped him. Because they were property, and he was nothing. What he had was a ship, a helmet, a set of skills that no other child anywhere possessed, and a fury that had nowhere to go. He was 10 years old, and he had a starship, and he knew how to fly it. Now, what happens to a child in that situation is normally very simple and very short. He gets robbed. He gets killed. He gets taken by somebody who sees a valuable vessel and a small boy standing next to it and does the obvious arithmetic. The galaxy that Boba Fett was thrown into was not a forgiving place, and the parts of it he knew how to reach were the worst parts of all, because they were the parts his father had worked in. He should not have survived the first year. He did survive it, and the way he survived it tells you exactly what kind of person he was going to become, because he did not survive it by being tough. He survived it by being useful to people who were more dangerous than he was, and by paying very close attention to how they operated, and by never once forgetting that every single one of them would sell him the moment it became profitable. He fell in with the professionals almost immediately. There was nowhere else to fall. He knew the names because he had heard them at his father's table. He knew the ports where the work got handed out. He knew what a job looked like and how a crew got assembled, and roughly what a fair split was, which is more than most adults in that trade ever learned. And there was one thing he had that nobody else had, which was that in a business built on reputation, he had inherited the best one going. He was Jango Fett's son. In certain rooms, that was worth more than a weapon. It got him listened to. It got him a seat. It also got him underestimated constantly, which turned out to be the most valuable inheritance of all. The first person to take him seriously was the pale woman with the braid. Aura Singh found him, or he found her, in the aftermath of everything. And she did what predators do with an asset. She took him on, she taught him, and she used him thoroughly and without any pretense of affection. Because a child who nobody suspects can walk into places that an adult professional cannot. He was not a fool about it. That is important. He knew what she was. He had been raised by a man who taught him to read a room and count the exits, and he could read Aura Singh perfectly well. But he was 10 years old and alone and burning with a need to do something about what had happened on that red planet, and she was offering the means to do it. So he took the arrangement, and he watched her, and he learned every single thing she knew, and he filed away the way she treated him for later use. Because he had a target. He had picked it out on the day it happened. There was a man who had come down onto that sand and ended his father in front of a crowd, and Boba Fett intended to make him pay for it. And he was 10 years old and utterly serious about it, in a way that adults found genuinely disturbing. What followed was a campaign, and calling it a campaign is not an exaggeration, because it was planned and layered, and it very nearly worked. He got himself inside a Republic military academy by pretending to be exactly what he looked like, which was a young clone cadet, which he technically was. Nobody questioned it. Why would they? He wore the face. He walked among the soldiers who were his brothers and were not, sleeping in their bunks, eating at their tables, being addressed by a designation, and all the time he was moving through the ship toward the man he had come to kill. He planted a bomb in the quarters of a Jedi Master, and it did not get the man he wanted. It got somebody else instead. A different Jedi, which is a detail worth sitting with, because it means the first life Boba Fett ever took was a mistake, and it did not slow him down at all. Then he sabotaged the ship, brought down a warship's reactor from the inside, at the age of about 10, and got clear of it, and took hostages out of the wreckage, and used them exactly the way he had watched Cad Bane use hostages, as a lever against people whose consciences would not let them accept losses. It failed in the end. The man he was hunting did not die. The hostages were recovered. Boba Fett was taken into custody and sat across a table from Jedi who asked him why, and he told them why. And he did not apologize, and he did not cry, and he did not bargain. He told them, quite calmly, that he was going to finish this eventually, and then he went to a cell. He was a child. He had crippled a capital ship, killed a Jedi, taken hostages off a hostage rescue. and looked the order in the eye and promised to come back. And that was the beginning. They put him in a facility for the young and the violent, which in a galaxy at war was a category that had grown considerably. And in that facility, he met the Trandoshan. Bossk was already an adult, and already a professional, and already a great deal more dangerous than a boy that age had any business being near. And the two of them formed the closest thing to a partnership that either of them would ever manage. It was not friendship, exactly. Bossk was not capable of friendship in a form most species would recognize. But there was something between them that lasted for years, a kind of grudging mutual usefulness. And the older hunter did teach him things, and did, on several occasions, come and get him out of situations that would otherwise have finished him. They got out together, of course. People like that do not stay in cells. And once he was out, Boba Fett went back to the only life available to him, which was the work. Here we should pause, because a great deal happened to the galaxy in a very short span. And it happened to him too. And it shaped him. The war ended, not the way anybody expected. The Republic that had built those millions of soldiers turned into something else overnight, an empire, run by a man who had been quietly arranging the whole thing from the beginning. And the Jedi Order, which had spent 1,000 generations as the most stable institution in the galaxy, was destroyed in a single night by the very soldiers it had been leading. Think about what that meant for a boy who wore that face. The clones did it. His brothers. Millions of men grown from his father's body, marching into temples and outposts and field camps, and killing the people they had fought beside for years because a switch in their heads had been thrown by a voice on a comm. Whatever complicated feelings Boba Fett had about the soldiers who shared his face, they now included the knowledge that his father's body had been used to end the Jedi Order, and that his father had been paid to allow it, and that the man who had arranged the payment now ruled the galaxy. And then, over the following years, he had to watch what happened to them afterward. They were not rewarded, they were replaced. The Empire quietly stopped growing them, because grown soldiers were expensive and volunteers were cheap, and volunteers did not have the unsettling habit of developing personalities. The clones aged at twice the natural rate, which had been designed into them so that they would be usable quickly, and the consequence was that men who were biologically old and chronologically young began to be pushed out of the service and into whatever life they could find. Some of them ended up on backwater worlds. Some ended up begging. Some ended up in the same cantinas where the bounty hunters drank, prematurely gray, still standing like soldiers, telling stories nobody wanted to hear. Boba Fett saw them. He could hardly avoid it. He walked through a galaxy that was slowly filling with discarded copies of himself, and every one of them was a demonstration of what he would have been if his father had not made that one strange demand at a negotiating table on a rainy world. He was the only one of them who had been given the chance to be a person. He never forgot that. It did not make him sentimental about them. If anything, it did the opposite. It made him certain that a man is worth exactly what he can make himself worth. And nothing is given. And belonging to something larger is a way of being spent by somebody else. So he belonged to nothing. That is the second great fact about him, after the arena. And it is the one that separates him from every other name on our list. Cad Bane worked for the Separatists, then for the Republic, then for whoever was paying. But he moved in circles and had associates and ran crews. Aurra Sing collected students and hangers-on Bossk had a species and a religion and a father he was constantly failing to impress. Dirge had his hatred, which was a kind of belonging in itself. Boba Fett had nobody. And he arranged it that way deliberately. And he maintained it for decades with a discipline that borders on inhuman. He worked with people constantly. He was in crews, in teams, in temporary alliances that lasted exactly as long as the contract. He was polite about it in his fashion. He paid what he owed. He did not stab partners in the back for the pleasure of it, because that was bad business, and he was, above all, a businessman. But there was never once in his entire long life a moment where somebody could have said that Boba Fett was theirs. No employer owned him. No cause moved him. No crew could count on him past the terms of the job. And that is the thing that made him unkillable in a way that Dirge's regenerating flesh never managed. Because you cannot get to a man through people he does not have. Now, the armor. He had his father's helmet from the day of the arena, and eventually he had the rest of it. And it is worth understanding what that armor actually was, because it was not simply protection. It was Mandalorian. Beskar plate forged from an ore that could turn a lightsaber, made by a culture that had spent thousands of years at war with everything, including itself. To wear that armor in most of the galaxy was to make a statement. And the statement was not about wealth or fashion. Mandalorians had fought the Republic to a standstill. They had fought the Jedi and won engagements nobody thought could be won. Their name was a word people used to frighten children in a dozen sectors. And in some of those sectors, the children were right to be frightened. Whether Boba Fett was actually a Mandalorian is a question that was argued about for a very long time. And the arguments were furious. And some of the people arguing had a personal stake in the answer. His father had been raised among them. Jango Fett had been taken in as a boy by a Mandalorian leader after his family was killed, had been raised in that culture, had fought in its wars, and by the reckoning of many, had held the title of their leader for a period. Others said the title was never properly his, that he was an adopted outsider who had claimed something he had no right to. Mandalorian politics were like that. They were essentially a series of ongoing arguments conducted with weapons, and Boba was a clone, which introduced a question nobody had ever had to answer before. If a culture defines membership by adoption and deed rather than blood, then a copy of a member raises no philosophical problem at all. But if a culture is a family, and the man in question was grown in a tank as part of a commercial transaction, then what exactly is he? He did not seem to care about the question for most of his life, which is itself revealing. He wore the armor because it worked. He spoke the language because his father had taught it to him. He did not participate in Mandalorian affairs, did not answer their calls, did not involve himself in their endless internal wars, and for decades he treated the entire culture as somebody else's problem. That is going to change later, in a way that will surprise you. For now, though, he took the plate, and he stripped it, and he repainted it. Not blue and silver, green, weathered green and dull rust and scuffed metal. A paint scheme that looked like it had been through a lot because it had. And he added things his father had never carried. A cape over one shoulder, a rangefinder that swung down over the visor. Wookiee braids hung across the chest. Those braids deserve a sentence, because they became the most misunderstood detail of his entire presentation. Most people assumed they were trophies from kills, Wookiees hunted, Wookiees killed. Hunter takes a braid. Simple, terrifying, extremely good advertising. Whether that was actually what they were is less certain than the reputation suggests. And there were other explanations, some of them considerably more complicated. But he never explained. Not once, to anybody, in 60 years. He let people assume the worst thing they could think of, and that assumption did a large amount of work for him that he would otherwise have had to do with a weapon. That was the method, in fact. And it is worth stating plainly, because it is the difference between him and everyone else in the profession. Cad Bane was frightening because of what he did. Boba Fett was frightening because of what people were not sure he might do. He was silent, almost pathologically so. He would stand in a room full of hard men negotiating loudly and say nothing at all, and the silence would do more than the argument. He did not threaten. Threatening is a form of negotiation, and negotiation implies there is something to negotiate. He did not brag, ever, which in that profession was so unusual that it was itself a kind of intimidation. Because bragging is what people do when they need you to believe something. And behind the presentation there was an arsenal that justified every bit of it. The armor carried a jetpack with a rocket in the housing, capable of taking a small ship's hull, plating off at close range. The gauntlets held a flamethrower, a fiber cord whip with a grapple, a dart launcher that could be loaded with anything from a paralytic to something considerably worse, a miniature blade, a comm suite. The helmet gave him a broadband scanner, infrared, motion sensing, a targeting rangefinder, filtration, and a sealed air supply that let him operate in vacuum or in atmospheres that would strip a lung. He carried a rifle he had modified past recognition, and a sidearm he rarely needed. None of that made him unusual. Plenty of professionals carried comparable equipment. What made him unusual was that he never depended on any of it. That is a thing his father taught him, and he learned better than the lesson was taught. Equipment fails. Ships get shot down. Gauntlets get crushed. There is a moment in almost every long career where the professional finds himself somewhere with nothing. And what happens next is determined entirely by what he is like when the gear is gone. Boba Fett spent his life preparing for that moment with a thoroughness that seemed obsessive right up until the day it saved him. So, he built a career. It took years, and most of those years were unremarkable, which is exactly what you would expect, and exactly what nobody ever puts in the stories. He took small jobs. He collected debts for people who did not deserve to be paid. He tracked down smugglers who had skimmed cargo, and gamblers who had run, and minor officials who had been indiscreet. He got paid, and he put the money into the ship, and he took the next job. He was reliable. That was the entire product. Anybody could hurt somebody. What the galaxy would pay a premium for was certainty, and Boba Fett sold certainty. If you gave him a name and a fee, the matter was concluded. Not usually concluded. Concluded. It might take a week or it might take a year, and he might disappear for 4 months without a word, and then arrive at your door with the target sedated in a container. But the outcome did not vary. That reputation is what eventually brought him to the attention of 2 very different kinds of employer. And between them they defined the next 20 years of his life. The first was a Hutt. Jabba Dezilijik Tiore ran his operation out of a fortified palace on a desert world at the end of every nowhere. And if you wanted to understand power in the Outer Rim, you understood it by understanding him. He was not a warlord. He was worse. He was infrastructure. Spice moved because he permitted it. Ships docked because he was paid. Whole planets had economies that ran through his ledgers, and the Empire, which could have crushed him in an afternoon, largely did not bother, because a stable criminal monopoly is much easier to work with than the chaos that replaces it. Jabba employed bounty hunters constantly. It was a routine operating cost, and over time, out of everybody who came through that throne room looking for work, one hunter became the one he called when a job actually mattered. The relationship between them was strange and lasted decades. There was no loyalty in it. In the ordinary sense, Jabba was a Hutt, and Hutts regard everyone as a resource with legs. Boba Fett was Boba Fett, and would have walked out of that palace forever the moment a better offer arrived. And both of them knew it. But there was something that worked between them, and it worked because of the same quality that made him dangerous everywhere else. He did the job, and he did not have opinions about it, and he did not need managing. He also declined jobs, which nobody else in that palace ever did, and Jabba tolerated it, which tells you everything about how highly he was valued. The second employer was the Empire. And here the story gets more interesting. Because for a stretch of years, Boba Fett worked directly and repeatedly for the second most powerful individual in the galaxy. Darth Vader did not use bounty hunters often. He had a fleet. He had the Imperial security apparatus, a bureaucracy of informants, whole divisions whose function was to find people. When he reached outside all of that and hired freelancers, it was because he wanted something done that the machinery could not do. And it was usually because he wanted it done without leaving a record. Fett was on that shortlist from very early. He hunted rebels before there was a rebellion worth the name, back when it was scattered cells and disaffected senators and pilots stealing fighters. He tracked deserters. He retrieved people the Empire needed retrieved. He did work that never appeared in any archive and that a great many officers would have been executed for knowing about. And he took the money. And he never once became an Imperial. That distinction mattered more than it sounds. Thousands of capable people were absorbed by that machine, given ranks and uniforms and pensions and a place in a structure, and every one of them became predictable the moment they put the uniform on, because a man inside a structure can be reached through the structure. Fett stayed outside. He was hired. He was never owned. There is a strain of story about him working directly with Vader on operations that were never officially acknowledged, hunting a particular fugitive across a string of worlds, being sent after things rather than people. Some of those accounts are more reliable than others. What is certain is that Vader knew exactly who he was, by name, on sight, and treated him differently from the other freelancers, with something that a person watching might reasonably have called respect. That is not a small thing. Darth Vader did not respect people. He tolerated the useful and destroyed the rest, which brings us, eventually, to a Corellian smuggler with a fast ship and a debt. Han Solo was not, at that point in his life, an important person. He was a competent pilot with an unusually quick ship and a talent for talking himself into trouble at roughly the same rate he talked himself out of it. He ran cargo that other people did not want inspected. He worked for the Hutts, among others, because the Hutts paid. and because a man who had walked away from a military career under unhelpful circumstances did not have a wide range of options. And on one particular run, he made a decision that most smugglers make eventually, which was to dump a hold full of somebody else's spice rather than be caught with it. It was the correct decision. It was the only decision. An Imperial patrol had come in on him, and there was no version of that encounter where he kept the cargo and stayed free. Any experienced smuggler would have done exactly the same thing, but the cargo belonged to Jabba the Hutt, and Jabba did not accept circumstances as an explanation. He accepted payment. The debt was substantial, and Solo did not have it. And so a price went onto his name, and it stayed there, and it grew, and it became one of the standing contracts that every professional in the sector knew about the way you know about weather. For years, that bounty was simply background. It got picked up occasionally by hunters who fancied their chances, and it got put down again when they discovered that the man they were chasing flew a ship that was considerably faster than it had any right to be, and traveled with a Wookiee who could remove a person's arms. Then the galaxy changed. A battle station the size of a small moon was destroyed by a rebel strike. And the man who flew the ship that got the pilots into position was the same Corellian smuggler with the Hutt debt. Overnight, a minor delinquent account became an Imperial priority target, with the personal attention of the Emperor's enforcer attached to it. Now the price was enormous, and now everybody wanted it. And now the hunt was real. What followed was 3 years of pursuit, and it is the most instructive stretch in the entire story, because it is where the difference between Boba Fett and every other professional in the galaxy becomes measurable rather than rhetorical. Everybody hunted Han Solo. Everybody. Bossk hunted him and did not get him. Dengar hunted him and did not get him, and had a personal grudge attached to the contract that made him try harder than the money justified. Zuckuss and 4-LOM, a strange and effective pairing, hunted him and did not get him. Score, Jodo Kast, Bylurt Valance, Zadra, Ophid. Score again. A long list of names that were serious in their day. All of them took a run at the same target across the same 3 years, and every one of them came back with nothing or did not come back at all. The reason they failed was not that Solo was better than them. He was a good pilot in a fast ship with a lot of luck and a very short list of friends who would die for him. And that combination beat a great many professionals because it kept producing situations they had not planned for. Boba Fett did not lose to those situations because Boba Fett did not put himself into them. Watch how he worked. Because the method is the whole argument. He did not chase. Chasing is what the others did, and chasing put them in the smuggler's arena, where the ship's speed and the pilot's improvisation decided everything. Fett let other people chase. He followed the chasers. He listened. He built a picture of where the man went when things went wrong, which is the only thing you actually need to know about a fugitive, because everybody has a small number of places they run to, and they run to them every single time. He also did not do it quickly, and that patience was the thing nobody could match. Bounty hunting rewards speed in a shallow way because the fee goes to whoever arrives first. But the biggest fees are on the targets who have survived every fast attempt, and those are won by whoever is willing to spend a year being wrong. He spent years. He took other work in the gaps. Because a professional does not sit idle waiting on one name. And in the background, quietly, without any announcement, he kept assembling the map. Once, in that period, he nearly had it. He got close enough that a different kind of man would have committed, and he did commit, in a way that involved deception and patience and a fair amount of nerve. And it came apart at the last stage. That is what happens. Most attempts come apart. The relevant fact is not that it failed. The relevant fact is what he did afterward, which was nothing dramatic at all. He withdrew. He did not retaliate. He did not escalate. He did not go looking for satisfaction. He simply went back to the map and added what he had learned. That is the temperament that makes a hunter dangerous over a whole career rather than a good season, and it is astonishingly rare. Almost everybody in that profession, given a near miss, takes it personally. Taking it personally is how Aura Singh eventually came unstuck. It is how Bosk spent his entire life failing upward. It is how a great many capable people ended up dead in ditches on worlds nobody has heard of. Boba Fett never took anything personally after the age of 10. He had used up his entire lifetime allocation of that particular emotion in an arena on a red planet. And afterward, there was simply nothing left in him to insult. And so the pieces moved into place. The Empire built its pressure. The rebellion lost its hidden base in the ice and scattered. And in the confusion of that retreat, a freighter with a failed hyperdrive slipped away into a field of tumbling rock, and a fleet of star destroyers spent hours failing to find it in there. Somewhere above that asteroid field, on the bridge of the largest warship ever built, a Dark Lord decided that his navy had disappointed him for the last time and gave an order that had never been given in quite that way before. He sent for the hunters. They came aboard. And the sight of them standing together on that deck is one of the strangest images the galaxy ever produced. A pair of assassin droids, angular and silent. A Trandoshan with a mortar launcher. A bandaged human with a rifle and a grievance. A creature that breathed ammonia and read the future. A protocol droid gone very wrong. Half a dozen more. The finest and least pleasant collection of professionals ever assembled in one room, standing in a line while an Imperial officer looked at them with visible disgust, and a black armored figure walked slowly down the row. At the end of the row stood a man in green. He said almost nothing. He was told there would be no disintegrations, which is a detail that has been repeated so often that people forget what it actually means. It means that the man in green had a documented history of bringing back targets in a condition that made questioning them impossible, and that this had happened often enough to require an explicit instruction. He acknowledged it, and then, while every other hunter in that room scattered to run sensor sweeps and quarter the asteroid field and do exactly what the Imperial Navy had already spent hours failing to do, Boba Fett went back to his ship, and he did not sweep anything at all. He sat, and he waited, and he thought about garbage. Because a Star Destroyer that has finished searching does one thing before it jumps away. Every time, without exception, and it is the kind of routine operational detail that nobody in the fleet thinks about and nobody in the profession bothers to learn. It dumps its refuse. He was about to win a 3-year contest against every other bounty hunter in the galaxy by understanding a waste disposal procedure. But that is where we will leave him for now. Sitting in a battered ship in the shadow of a fleet, waiting for a moment that nobody else in that room had thought to wait for. Because what happens next is the part everybody thinks they know. The trap on the Cloud City, the carbon freezing, the slab of a man carried out through a corridor, and then, a little later, a pit in the sand, and a very long fall. And the moment when the entire galaxy agreed that Boba Fett was finally, definitively dead. The galaxy was wrong. It was wrong by about 40 years. And the part of his life that came afterward is stranger and larger, and considerably more dangerous than everything you have heard so far. We will get to it. Rest now. So, back to the asteroid field. If you have just joined us, or if you drifted off somewhere in the last stretch and have come back to find a different story running, here is where we are. We are trying to settle an old argument about who the most dangerous bounty hunter in the history of the galaxy actually was. We have walked the field, and the field was frightening. And we have followed one man from a rainstorm on a world that officially did not exist, through an arena where he watched his father die at about 10 years old, through the long, grinding years where an orphan with a starship turned himself into the most reliable professional alive, and we left him sitting in a battered ship in the shadow of an Imperial fleet, not searching for anything, thinking about garbage. Here is what he understood that nobody else did. A Star Destroyer is a city. It carries tens of thousands of people, and those people generate waste. And the waste has to go somewhere, and a warship in a combat zone does not vent it continuously because a debris trail is a navigational hazard and a tracking opportunity. So it holds the waste, and it dumps it in one mass, and it dumps it immediately before jumping to light speed, because that is the moment when nobody is looking and the ship is about to be somewhere else anyway. It is a procedural detail. It appears in operating manuals. It is the least glamorous piece of information in the entire Imperial Navy. And it was, on that particular day, the most valuable, because a small ship with magnetic clamps could attach itself to the hull of a Star Destroyer, wait out the search, and then let go into a cloud of tumbling refuse at the exact moment that the sensors of every other ship in the fleet were turned somewhere else. That is what the freighter did. That is what a very good pilot with a broken hyperdrive and no options would do. And Boba Fett had been thinking about that pilot for years, and he knew the man well enough by then to know that he did not surrender and he did not run in straight lines. And he would find the one trick nobody had tried. So while the rest of the hunters combed the rocks, and while the Imperial Navy tracked nothing at all, Boba Fett moved his ship into the sensor shadow directly behind the largest warship in the fleet and simply waited to see what fell off it. And something did. He did not attack it. Understand that this is the entire lesson. He had the target dead in front of him, alone, damaged, with no hyperdrive, and he did not attack. Any of the others would have attacked, and any of the others would have got a fight in an asteroid field against a pilot who was better than them at exactly that, and any of the others would have lost him. Fett followed, quietly, at distance, with his own systems minimized, for as long as it took. He wanted to know where the man went when he was out of options, because that was the piece of the map he had never been able to fill in, and now the man was out of options in the most complete way possible and would have to go somewhere. The somewhere was a city in the clouds. It hung in the upper atmosphere of a gas giant, a mining colony grown wealthy and elegant, a place of open terraces and white corridors and long views over an endless sunset. It was run by an old associate of the smuggler, a charming and pragmatic man who had won and lost several fortunes and was at that moment presiding over a small, quiet, technically independent operation that the Empire had somehow never got around to noticing. Fett watched the freighter dock. Then he opened a channel to a fleet several days behind him and told them where to come. What happened in that city over the next day is one of the ugliest sequences in the whole of galactic history. And it is worth telling slowly, because it is where the question of what Boba Fett actually was gets its hardest test. The Empire arrived first. That is the part people forget. Vader was already in the city, sitting in the dining room, when the fugitives walked in, because the administrator had been given a choice between betraying a friend and watching his entire population dragged into an imperial labor program, and he had made the choice that a responsible administrator makes and had hated himself for it immediately. And then Vader did something that surprised everybody, including his own officers. He was not there for the smuggler. He had never been there for the smuggler. He was there for a boy who had blown up a battle station, a young man with a great deal of raw talent and a surname that Vader had not spoken aloud in 20 years, and the smuggler and the princess and the Wookiee were bait. Nothing more. Vader intended to take the boy alive and intact, and he intended to use a technology that had never been tried on a living person before, and he needed to know whether it worked. So he tested it. That is what the carbon freezing chamber was. It was industrial equipment. It existed to flash freeze raw Tibanna gas into transportable blocks, and it had never been designed for anything with a nervous system, and the odds of a human being surviving the process were unknown and generally assumed to be poor. They put Han Solo in it to find out. Stand back from the scene for a moment and look at who is in that room. There is a Dark Lord conducting an experiment on a man he does not care about at all. There is an administrator watching his own city being used for something he never agreed to. There is a Wookiee being physically restrained, while his friend is walked to a pit. There is a woman saying something she has been refusing to say for 3 years and getting an answer that is not the answer anybody expected. And standing off to the side, saying nothing, is a man in green armor whose only concern in the entire event is whether the merchandise will still be worth money afterward. He said so. It is one of the very few things he said out loud that day. He wanted assurance that if the smuggler died in the chamber, he would be compensated, because he had a buyer waiting, and a dead man was worth considerably less than a live one. That is not cruelty. It is something colder than cruelty and much rarer. Cruelty requires you to care about the suffering in front of you, at least enough to enjoy it. Fett was not enjoying anything. He was standing in the middle of one of the most emotionally violent events of the era, surrounded by people whose lives were being destroyed in real time. And his entire internal experience of it was an accounting question. The chamber cycled. The platform came back up. And a man who had been alive a minute earlier was now a slab of carbonite with a face frozen into it. Arms out, mouth open. He was alive. Barely. The readings said so. Vader had his answer about the technology, and he handed the slab over to the bounty hunter as casually as passing a receipt, and turned his attention to the boy who was already on his way. Boba Fett got his prize out of that city, while the rest of it came apart behind him. There was a rescue attempt. There was very nearly a good one. A Wookiee got free, and a princess got a blaster. And the administrator changed sides at exactly the point where changing sides was still useful. And they came for him through the corridors and the landing platforms with everything they had. They were too late by about 90 seconds. That is the margin. 3 years of pursuit by every hunter in the galaxy, an entire fleet, a Dark Lord, a betrayed friendship, and the outcome came down to a minute and a half in a corridor. Boba Fett got the slab into the belly of his ship, sealed it, lifted off, and was gone into the clouds before the pursuit reached the platform. He then flew a route so cautious that it took considerably longer than it needed to. He assumed he was being followed, because he assumed that always. He crossed sectors he did not need to cross. He sat still in empty systems for days at a time, watching his own sensors. Somewhere in that period, there were attempts to take the cargo off him, because a frozen man worth that much money attracts attention. And every one of those attempts failed, and some of the people who made them did not go home. And then he brought it to the desert. The palace sat out beyond the Dune Sea, a squat stone fortress built into a ridge, and inside it, a hut sat on a raised dais, surrounded by a court of the most unpleasant beings in the sector. The doors opened. The bounty hunter came in with a repulsor sled, and the sled had a man on it. There is no record of what he was paid. And it does not matter, because the payment was not the point. The hut did not sell the slab. He did not ship it off-world. He did not put it in a vault. He hung it on the wall of his throne room, upright, lit from below, like a piece of art. And he left it there, and for the better part of a year, every single visitor to that palace walked past a living man mounted in a block of metal as a demonstration of what happened to people who did not pay. And Boba Fett stayed. That is a detail worth pausing on, because he did not usually stay anywhere. He took payment and left, but he spent a good deal of that year in the palace, coming and going, taking small work, present in the court. Some of that was practical. Tatooine was a convenient base, and the hut paid promptly, and there was no shortage of jobs. But part of it, and there is no way to prove this, but the pattern is very suggestive, was that he did not entirely trust the situation. He had put an extremely valuable and extremely dangerous man on a wall in a room full of idiots, and the man had friends who had already come very close to taking him back once. He was right to be uneasy. They came, eventually, and they came cleverly. First, a droid pair, delivered as a gift, accepted without inspection. Then a Wookiee, brought in chains by a bounty hunter, who was not a bounty hunter at all, but a princess in a helmet. Then a young man in dark robes who walked in through the front gate with no weapon and asked politely for the release of a prisoner. The hut refused, obviously. Huts do not respond to politeness. And that refusal set in motion the sequence that would eventually put Boba Fett into a pit in the sand. And there are two things about what happened out there on that skiff that almost nobody gets right. The first is that he did not lose that fight. Look at the actual sequence. The barge went out over the Dune Sea, carrying the hut and his entire court and a group of prisoners bound for execution. The prisoners had smuggled a weapon aboard. When it turned fast. And within about a minute, the situation on those skiffs had gone from a routine execution to a full engagement with a Jedi in it. And Boba Fett handled it. He got airborne. He got positioned. He used the fiber cord from his gauntlet to wrap a lightsaber arm, which is a thing almost nobody in the galaxy would have had the nerve or the reflexes to attempt at that range. He was, at the moment everything went wrong. In the process of winning, what ended him was noise. A blind man, standing on a moving platform, swinging a pike he could not see, hit a jetpack he did not know was there. That is the entire event. It was not a duel. It was not a defeat. It was a man who had been rendered temporarily sightless by a year in carbon freeze, flailing at a sound and connecting with the one component in the entire encounter that would produce a catastrophe. The pack fired. It fired at the wrong angle with a damaged housing, and it drove him into the side of the barge. And he came off it and went down the slope of the sand and into the mouth. The second thing almost nobody gets right is what the thing in the sand actually was. The pit was a mouth. Underneath it, filling most of a large depression in the desert, was an organism that had been sitting in that spot for tens of thousands of years, older than most civilizations, older than a great many species. It did not hunt. It did not need to. It had simply arrived at some point in the unimaginable past, dug itself in, opened its mouth, and waited. And the desert had eventually built a road past it, and a settlement near it, and a palace above it, and people had begun feeding it. And the thing that made it a horror rather than merely a predator was what it did with what it caught. It did not kill. It absorbed, slowly, over an enormous span of time. A person who went into that pit was not eaten. They were kept, held in a vast chamber of digestive tissue, paralyzed, nourished by the creature's own fluids, conscious, aware, and dissolved by degrees, across a period measured not in hours but in centuries. That was the reputation, and the reputation was well earned. And it was why the Hutt used it. Because a quick execution teaches nobody anything but 1,000 years of digestion is a story people repeat. So the galaxy wrote him off. And the galaxy was entirely reasonable to do so. Word went round the profession within weeks. Boba Fett was gone, not killed in a fight, which would have been respectable, but taken by a hole in the ground on a nothing planet, at the tail end of a job that had gone wrong because a blind man got lucky. Bounties that had been quietly avoided while he was alive got picked up again. A number of people who had been extremely careful for a long time relaxed. Some of them relaxed permanently, which was a mistake, because here is what happened in the dark. He was conscious. That is the first thing, and it is the worst thing. He was fully conscious inside a body of living tissue with no light and no air that was not being provided by his own sealed helmet supply. And the supply was finite, and around him the walls were working. He was also not alone in there, in a sense. And the sense in which he was not alone was not a comfort. That stomach had been collecting for a very long time. There were things in there, wreckage, bone, armor plate, from cultures that had stopped existing before the Republic was founded. And there were, according to the account he later gave, though he gave it rarely and to very few people, things still moving. What saved him was every single boring decision he had made over the previous 40 years. The armor was sealed, which meant the digestive fluid could not reach skin. That was not luck. He had spent his life maintaining that seal for vacuum work and for atmospheres that would strip a lung. And he had checked it obsessively, and the habit that had always looked like paranoia now bought him hours. The helmet had its own air supply, which bought him more. The gauntlets had a flamethrower, and the flamethrower had fuel. And living tissue does not enjoy being burned. And the jetpack, the broken jetpack that had put him in there, still had propellant in it. What he did in that chamber took an amount of time that he never specified and that nobody has ever managed to pin down. And it involved burning and cutting and climbing through material that does not bear description and using a damaged rocket in an enclosed space full of flammable gas, in a way that a rational person would calculate as fatal, and that he calculated as the only remaining option. The creature convulsed. Something in the wall gave, and out on the surface of that desert, in the aftermath of a fight that everybody involved had long since flown away from, the sand shifted, and a scorched and gas-burned and half-dissolved figure in ruined green plate dragged itself up out of a hole in the ground and got 100 meters or so from the edge and collapsed. He should have died there. That is not an exaggeration. He was outside in the open in a desert that killed people with a considerably lower level of injury than that, with chemical burns over most of his body, with an armor seal that had finally failed, unconscious in daylight. And the person who found him was a bounty hunter. Of all the endings the universe could have arranged, it arranged that one. The man who had spent his entire life ensuring that he needed nobody, that no one could reach him through a friend, because he had no friends, that no crew could count on him, and he would count on no crew, was lying face down in the sand outside a monster's mouth. And the only reason he lived was that a rival came along and decided not to leave him there. It was Dengar, the bandaged human with the surgically removed capacity for hesitation. The man who had been rebuilt by Imperial doctors into something that was supposed to be incapable of exactly this kind of decision, walked up on a dying competitor in the middle of nowhere with nobody watching, and did not finish him, and did not strip his gear, and did not walk away. He carried him out. He treated the burns. He kept him alive across a stretch of days when it was not at all obvious that it was going to work. Why he did it is a question worth sitting with, because nothing in Dengar's history predicts it. The most likely answer, and the one he more or less gave when pressed, is that some part of the man the Empire had cut apart was still in there and had opinions, and that leaving a person in a desert to die of chemical burns was one of the few things it still had an opinion about. Whatever the reason, it created something that Boba Fett had spent 40 years making structurally impossible. He now owed somebody. He paid it, too, in his own peculiar way. And the way he paid it is one of the strangest small stories in his whole life. Dengar was in love, which was itself surprising, with a woman from a species that could share emotion directly through a device she wore, which for a man who had been surgically stripped of most of his feelings was a rather specific kind of miracle. And when they were married, at a ceremony out in the wastes with almost nobody present, the man in green armor was there. He stood at the back. He did not speak. He left early, but he was there, and he had come deliberately. And for a person constructed the way he was constructed, that was an enormous statement. That is not a softening. Do not mistake it for one. The decades that followed were in many ways the most lethal of his life. But it is the first crack in the wall, and there will be more. And where those cracks eventually lead is the part of this story that nobody sees coming. Now, he came back to a galaxy that had changed while he was inside a stomach. The Empire had lost. Not entirely, not immediately, but the second battle station had gone the way of the first, and the Emperor was dead, and Darth Vader was dead. And the enormous machine that had run the galaxy for 2 decades was breaking into pieces that spent the next several years fighting each other and losing to a new republic that had come from nowhere and now held the capital. For most people, this was liberation. For the bounty hunting profession, it was an economic boom of historic proportions. Understand why. A stable government with a functioning legal system does not need many bounty hunters because it has courts and police and jurisdiction. A galaxy in which the old order has collapsed and the new one controls perhaps a third of the territory it claims, is a galaxy with an enormous number of people who urgently need finding and no legitimate mechanism to find them. Imperial officers with warrants on their heads scattering into the outer rim, warlords carving out territory, collaborators fleeing, fortunes moving, grudges from 20 years of occupation coming due all at once. The work was endless, and Boba Fett walked back into it as though nothing had happened. He did not announce his return. That would have been out of character, and it also would have been bad tactics, because for a period of time there was a real advantage in being a dead man. He simply started appearing again, and the stories started coming back, and the profession slowly worked out that the reports had been premature. There was an incident with a man who had been wearing his colors while he was gone. Jodo Kast was a competent hunter who had made a business decision. Fett was dead. The reputation was worth a fortune, and a reputation is only a set of visual cues and a certain silence. So he acquired armor of the right pattern, and he painted it the right green, and he began taking jobs while allowing people to draw the obvious conclusion, and it worked extremely well for a while. It stopped working on the day the original came to see him. There was no negotiation about it. There is a version of that story where Fett gives the man a chance to walk away, and there is a version where he does not. And the versions disagree because the only person who could confirm it never discussed it. What everybody agrees on is that Jodo Kast died, and that he died in a way that was communicated efficiently to everybody else who had been considering the same business model, and that nobody tried it again. That is worth noting because it is one of the few times in his life that Boba Fett did something for a reason that was not money. The reputation was an asset. He had spent 40 years building it deliberately, and he understood better than anyone that the reputation did more work than the weapons did, and a counterfeit devalues the original. And the smuggler. What about the smuggler? This is where a lot of people expect a final confrontation, and it never quite arrives. And the reason it never arrives is the most revealing thing about him in the entire back half of his life. They met again, more than once. There were encounters across those years that ranged from tense standoffs to actual exchanges of fire, and Han Solo spent a considerable amount of time expecting, reasonably, that Boba Fett was going to come for him eventually and finish the job. He did not because of forgiveness, which he did not possess, and not because of respect, though there may have been some, because the contract was closed. Jabba was dead. The debt had died with him. There was nobody left alive to pay for Han Solo, and Boba Fett did not do work that nobody was paying for. He said something to that effect. Eventually, in one of their later meetings, and it left the other man genuinely unsettled, because Solo had spent years carrying this thing as a personal feud and had just been informed that it had never been personal at all. He had been an invoice. The invoice had been paid, then voided, and the man who had frozen him and hung him on a wall had gone on to think about other things. There is no insult in the galaxy quite like being told you were never important. So what became of the others? We owe you this, because we promised it at the start, and the answers are the whole argument. Cad Bane, the one professional who could genuinely claim to have hunted Jedi and won, the man who took a legislature hostage and walked out, did not survive the era he dominated. His career burned extraordinarily bright for a handful of years, and then it ran into the one thing his method could not handle, which was a person who could not be leveraged, could not be frightened, could not be negotiated with, and did not care about hostages. The accounts of the end differ in their details, which is normal for events on that world in that period. And some of them are certainly embellished. What the persistent version says is that Bane took one job too many involving a particular family on a particular desert planet, and that he faced a much younger man who had every reason to want him gone, and that it happened fast, in the open, in daylight, and that the wide-brimmed hat came off in the dust and stayed there. There is a symmetry in it that historians find suspicious for exactly that reason. But the outcome is not in dispute. Cad Bane's career ended. Boba Fett's did not. Aurra Sing, who taught a 10-year-old orphan the trade and used him as a tool, and never for one moment considered that he was memorizing everything about her, including the way she treated people who had stopped being useful, came to an end that the accounts also disagree about. Some say she fell in a job that went badly. Some say she was taken by people she had wronged, of whom there were a great many. The version that has survived best, and the one that most of the profession believed, is that she was eventually collected by the boy, grown up, and that she never saw it coming because she had never once in her life imagined that the child had been keeping score. Dirge, the thing that could not be killed, was killed. That is the short version, and it is very nearly the whole version. He was crushed and he was burned, and he was, in the end, thrown somewhere that even his regeneration could not solve, by a Jedi at the absolute height of a power that was not remotely fair. The unkillable were only ever unkillable until they met something with no interest in the concept. IG-80. 8 was destroyed. Whatever the machine's larger ambitions had been, whatever the story about a mind copied into something enormous actually amounted to, it ended with a droid frame in pieces, and the surviving units did not accomplish whatever it was they had been building toward, and the galaxy went on not knowing how close it had come to something. Or possibly, not close at all. Zam Wesell was killed by an employer to prevent her from talking, which is the ending that waits for every professional who is good enough to be hired for something important and not important enough to be feared. Bossk lived. Of all of them, Bossk lived, and lived a very long time. And he is the only rival who is still standing in the last act of this story. But look at how he lived. He spent his final decades in a role that would have been unimaginable to the Trandoshan, who broke out of a juvenile facility with a boy in tow. He ended up taking orders, working within someone else's structure, doing what he was told by a man he had once taught. And Dengar, the one who found a dying man in the sand and did not walk away, also lived and married and got out, more or less, which in that profession is the rarest ending of all. So of the great names of the age, one was collected by our subject, one was almost certainly collected by our subject, one was destroyed by a Jedi, one was scrapped, one was murdered by her own client, one retired, and one ended up on the payroll. The field is empty. The argument is more or less over. And we are not even to the strangest part yet, because now we have to talk about what he did with the last third of his life. And it is nothing that anybody who knew him at 20 would have predicted. He became a king. Let us go back to the armor for a moment, and to the question we set aside earlier, because it comes due now. The Mandalorians had spent thousands of years being the most feared warrior culture in the galaxy, and roughly the same amount of time destroying themselves. That was the pattern. They would unify under a strong leader, become an unstoppable force, terrify everything within reach, and then fracture the instant the leader died, and spend a generation killing each other, and then unify again under someone new. By the time the empire fell, they were at the low end of that cycle and had been for a long while. Their home world had been bombed to slag more than once. Their population was scattered across a dozen systems working as mercenaries for whoever was hiring, which is to say, they had been reduced from a civilization to a labor pool. There were still clans. There were still traditions. There were still men and women in Beskar who would have gone through a wall for the right cause. But there was no cause, and there had not been a leader anybody agreed on in living memory. And the title was vacant. Mandalore. Not a king exactly, not in the way other cultures mean it. Something closer to a first among warriors. A person who holds the position because everybody with an opinion has decided not to argue about it anymore. Boba Fett had spent his entire adult life ignoring all of this. He had the strongest arguable claim of anyone alive, and he had never once pursued it. His father had held the title, or at least had been given it by people whose right to give it was disputed. He wore the armor. He spoke the language. He was, by the reckoning of some Mandalorians, exactly the sort of legendary figure they had been waiting for. And, by the reckoning of others, a tank-grown copy of a man who had himself been an outsider, which is to say not really one of them at all. He had no interest. For decades, he treated every approach from Mandalorian factions the way he treated every other approach, which was, as a business proposition, to be evaluated on price. What changed him was an invasion. And here we have to stop and describe what came out of the dark, because the galaxy had never seen anything like it, and has never seen anything like it since. And the story of Boba Fett does not make sense without it. They came from outside, not from the unknown regions, not from some overlooked corner of the disk. From outside the galaxy entirely, across the void between spiral arms, in a migration that had been traveling for thousands of years toward a destination they had chosen before anybody in the Republic could read or write. They were called the Yuuzhan Vong, and everything about them was wrong. They used no machines. Not as a philosophy, as a religion. Technology was blasphemy to them. Everything they possessed was grown. Their ships were living organisms, enormous coral vessels that healed their own hull breaches and screamed when they died. Their weapons were creatures. Their armor was a symbiotic thing that fed on the wearer. Their communications devices were small animals attached to the ear, and they could not be sensed through the Force. Take a moment with that, because it broke the single most important defensive advantage the galaxy possessed. Every Jedi in existence relied on an awareness that reached outward, that felt intent and danger and life. When the Yuuzhan Vong walked into a room, that sense reported an empty room. They were holes. They did not register as living things at all, and the effect on Jedi who encountered them was profoundly disorienting, like being blind in one eye and not knowing which. Their culture was built entirely around pain, not the infliction of it on enemies, although they were enthusiastic about that, on themselves. Their warriors mutilated their own bodies as a form of religious devotion, replacing limbs, scarring faces, escalating throughout a lifetime, because the gods valued suffering, and the highest expression of faith was to offer more of it. They sacrificed constantly. They regarded every non-believer in the galaxy as an offense that needed cleansing, and they had come to take everything The war they brought was the worst thing that had happened to that galaxy in living memory, and possibly the worst thing that had ever happened to it. Worlds were not conquered. They were converted, terraformed by living machinery into something the invaders considered holy, with whatever population had been on them used as raw material. Entire species were reduced to fractions. The New Republic, which had spent years congratulating itself on the end of tyranny, was rolled backward across sector after sector by an enemy that regarded its entire military doctrine as an insult to the gods. Coruscant fell. The capital of galactic civilization for 25,000 years fell and was remade, and the invaders put their own dead world's ecology onto it. And in the middle of that, with the galaxy genuinely ending, an old man in green armor made a decision that surprised everybody. He took the title. Nobody has ever fully explained why. He never explained it, because he never explained anything. The most likely reading, and the one that his behavior over the following years supports, is that he had spent his entire life belonging to nothing, and had watched what happened to people who belonged to things, and had concluded somewhere in that long, grinding stretch that a man with no people is a man whose life ends the moment he does. Whatever the reason, the Mandalorians got a leader for the first time in a very long time. And the leader they got was the most dangerous professional in the galaxy, and what he did with them was not what anybody expected. He did not lead a charge. There is no glorious battle in this part of the story. No last stand. No Beskar-clad host descending on the invaders while horns sounded. That would have been suicide, and he knew it. Because his people numbered in the tens of thousands, and the enemy numbered in the millions, and had eaten most of a galaxy on the way in. He did something far more characteristic. He hired them out to the enemy. Mandalorian mercenaries went to work for the Yuuzhan Vong, openly. Contracted, paid, deployed on operations against the New Republic, fighting alongside the invaders in the field. From the outside, it looked like the oldest and most cynical mercenary culture in the galaxy had done exactly what everybody had always expected it to do, which was sell itself to whoever was winning. The New Republic wrote them off. Other cultures spat at the name, and the Yuuzhan Vong, who did not understand deception because their own society regarded it as a form of cowardice, punishable by extremely creative means, accepted the arrangement at face value and put Mandalorian units into positions of genuine operational trust. Every one of those units was reporting to Boba Fett. For years, the single best stream of intelligence on Yuuzhan Vong deployments, fleet strength, command structure, doctrine and internal politics came out of men and women in Beskar who were standing in the room while the invaders made their plans. It went out quietly, through channels that were never acknowledged, to the people who could use it. And it was not only information. Operations that Mandalorian units were assigned to went wrong at a rate that should have been noticed. Not catastrophically. Never obviously. Just a little worse than they should have gone, consistently, for years. A pursuit that broke off slightly too early. A cordon with a soft spot in it. A report that arrived slightly late. The kind of subtle, sustained, deniable underperformance that requires absolute discipline from every single person involved. Because one man bragging in a cantina ends the entire operation and gets an entire culture exterminated. Nobody bragged. For years, across dozens of units, nobody bragged. That is a level of control over a famously ungovernable people that no Mandalorian leader had achieved in centuries, and it was achieved by a man who barely spoke. It did not last forever, of course. The invaders were vicious, but they were not stupid. And eventually the pattern became undeniable. And when it did, they responded the way they responded to everything. They went to Mandalore, and they burned what was left of it. By then it had already been burned more than once. There was not a great deal to take. The population that mattered was dispersed and armed and had been expecting it. And the price the Yuuzhan Vong paid for that particular act of retribution was higher than the value of the ground they took. And when the war finally ended, when the invaders were broken and the galaxy began the very long process of counting what was left, the Mandalorians were still there, reduced, scattered, alive, which is more than a great many older and grander civilizations could say. Boba Fett spent the years afterward doing something that would have been utterly unrecognizable to the man who took a smuggler off a cloud city. He rebuilt, he found a world, and he moved his people onto it. And he set about constructing an economy, mining mostly, because there was ore in the ground, worth having, and because a culture that only sells its warriors will eventually run out of warriors. He set up training. He arranged contracts. He made deals with governments who had spent the previous decade calling his people traitors. And he made those deals from a position of unusual strength, because everybody who mattered now knew what the Mandalorians had actually been doing during the war. And there is no negotiating leverage in the galaxy quite like a debt of that size. He was, in his 60s and 70s, an administrator. Think about how strange that is. The most feared bounty hunter in history. The silent figure in green who had spent decades being the thing that walked out of the dark. Spent his last decades worrying about ore prices and training rotations and whether the clans were going to start killing each other again. He was good at it. Of course, he was good at it. Every single thing that had made him a great hunter turned out to be exactly what a leader of that particular people needed. Patience. Absolute refusal to take anything personally. A total lack of interest in being liked. An understanding that a reputation, correctly managed, does more work than an army. But the personal cost of the way he had lived was about to come due, all at once, in the last stretch of his life. And it came due in the form of a family he had spent 40 years pretending not to have, because he had been married. It is the single most surprising fact in his entire biography, and almost nobody knows it. As a very young man, barely out of the disaster of his childhood, in a period of his life he never discussed with anyone, Boba Fett married a woman named Sintas Vel. She was a hunter herself, capable and hard. And by every account, she was not a mistake or a transaction. They were, briefly, genuinely something, and they had a daughter, Ailyn. It fell apart, as it was always going to fall apart. And the way it fell apart involved an accusation and an ugly separation and a young man who was constitutionally incapable of the thing that was being asked of him. He left. He was extremely young. And the life he had been raised into had not equipped him with a single tool for staying. And so he did the only thing he knew how to do, which was to go back to work and not look back. He did not see his daughter grow up. He did not send money. He did not check. For decades he behaved with total consistency, as though the entire episode had not occurred. Ailyn Vel grew up knowing exactly who her father was and hating him with a completeness that shaped her whole life. She became a bounty hunter, which is its own kind of statement, and she spent her adult years hunting him, and she never stopped. She wanted to kill him, not metaphorically. She built her career around getting close enough to do it. That is what his method cost. He had constructed a life in which nobody could get to him through the people he loved. And it had worked perfectly. And the result was that the only person in the galaxy who was actively trying to destroy him was his own child. She never managed it. And she did not die at his hands either, which would at least have had a grim symmetry to it. She died in an interrogation cell. In the years after the invasion, the galaxy went through another war, a civil one, and out of that war came a new, dark power. And the man who became that power was the son of a smuggler and a princess. He had been a good man once. He had been tortured by the invaders for a very long time and had come out of it convinced that suffering was a doorway and that the galaxy could be saved if somebody were willing to do the necessary things. He took Aylin Vel because she was a Mandalorian operative and he wanted information about Fett. He questioned her. He used everything he had. And by that point in his fall, he had a great deal. And she did not give him what he wanted. And it killed her. So the sequence is this. The man who froze Han Solo in carbonite and hung him on a wall for a year lost his daughter to Han Solo's son. There is no version of that which is not appalling. And there is no version of it in which the wheel does not feel like it has come all the way round. And then his granddaughter walked into his life. Mirta Gev was hard and suspicious and had grown up on a version of the family story in which the old man was entirely to blame for everything, which was not an unreasonable version. She came into his orbit under false pretenses, and she was carrying something he had not seen in 40 years. And the relationship between them started as something close to mutual hostility and turned, very slowly, over a period of years, into something else. She did not forgive him. That is important. She simply stayed and worked and argued with him and eventually became the closest thing to a successor that he had. And around the same time, the last great irony of his life arrived at his door and asked for help. Jaina Solo was a Jedi and a fighter pilot and the daughter of the man in the carbonite. And her twin brother was the man who had killed Aylin Vel in a cell, and she had come to the conclusion that she was the one who was going to have to stop him. She could not beat him. She knew she could not beat him. He was more powerful than her, and he had spent years becoming something she could not match in a straight contest. And every Jedi instinct she had been trained with was exactly wrong for the fight she needed to win. So she went looking for somebody who had spent a lifetime killing people who were more powerful than he was. And she found an old man on a mining world who had every conceivable reason to shut the door in her face. He had frozen her father. Her brother had killed his daughter. Her family had been a line item in his ledger for most of a century. He trained her. Sit with that image for a moment, because it is the last and best thing in this whole story. An old man in scarred green armor, dying, standing in a training yard with the daughter of the smuggler he sold to a hut, teaching her how a person with no force at all kills a person who has all of it, where to stand, how to make an enemy's power work against them, how to be patient, how to accept that you will be hit, and to plan for the moment afterward instead of the moment itself. Everything his father had taught him on a ship in the rain passed on, at the end, to the last person in the galaxy who should have received it. And he was dying, by the way. That is the other thing happening in these final years. The cloning had come for him at last. Every one of his brothers had aged at twice the natural rate and had been used up and discarded decades earlier. And he had always been the exception, the unaltered one, the one who got to be a person. But there was something in the underlying template that had never been entirely right. And it caught up with him in his 70s as a degenerative illness that his body could not resolve. He hunted a cure the way he had hunted everything else, methodically, without complaint, going back eventually toward the science that had made him in the first place. And what he found bought him time rather than a solution. And in that same last stretch, he got one more thing back. Cintas Vel, the woman he had married as a young man and abandoned, was not dead. She had been in carbonite for the better part of 60 years, frozen and stored and forgotten by people who had put her there for reasons that had long since stopped mattering. The man who had built the back half of his career on carbon freezing a human being got his wife back out of it. She came out damaged, as anyone would after that long. Memory in pieces. Time collapsed. And the two of them, both very old in different ways, both carrying the same wreckage from opposite ends, had to work out what, if anything, was left. It is not a happy ending. It is something better than that, which is an honest one. He did not become a good man. He was never going to become a good man. And the story does not pretend otherwise. He simply, in the last part of a very long life, stopped arranging things so that he would be alone, and discovered that it was possible to have people, and that having people is expensive and paid the price anyway. There is one more thing worth saying before we answer the question, and it concerns what he was actually like, as opposed to what he was famous for, because the two are not the same, and the gap between them is instructive. People who dealt with him professionally across those 60 years left behind a surprisingly consistent set of impressions, and almost none of them match the legend. He was punctual. That comes up again and again from people who had every reason to describe him in more dramatic terms. If he said he would be somewhere, he was there. And he was there at the hour he had named. And if he was going to be late, he sent word. In a trade populated almost entirely by people who treated appointments as suggestions, this was so unusual that clients remarked on it decades afterward. He was honest about money. Not generous. Never generous. But he quoted a price and held to it. He did not renegotiate halfway through a job when he discovered the target was harder than advertised. And he did not pad an invoice. If a job came in cheaper than expected, he charged what he had quoted. If it came in far more expensive, he ate the difference and mentioned it in the next negotiation instead. He did not lie. This one surprises people most of all. A man in that profession has every incentive to deceive constantly. And Fett did deceive on operations as a tool, but in a room, in a negotiation, face to face with a client, he did not say things that were untrue. He would say nothing at all, which was far more common. Or he would say a small, hard fact, and the fact would be accurate. Employers learned quickly that if he told you a thing was going to happen, you could plan around it. He turned down work regularly, not out of squeamishness, exactly. And the line he drew was never announced and never explained, but it existed. There were jobs he did not take and clients he did not work for twice, and people who tried to find the pattern generally failed. And he was, by the account of nearly everybody who spent time in a room with him, unbearably calm, not serene. Nothing about him was serene. Calm the way a closed door is calm. Loud rooms went quiet around him, and he never appeared to notice. Men who had spent their lives being the most frightening person in any given space found themselves talking too much in his presence and could not afterward explain why. The most repeated single observation about him from clients and rivals and law enforcement across 6 decades is some version of the same sentence. He listened. That was the whole trick in the end. Everybody else in that profession was busy being feared. He was busy paying attention. So, the question, who was the most dangerous bounty hunter in the history of the galaxy? Not the strongest. Dirge was stronger, and Dirge could not be killed by ordinary means. And Dirge is a smear on the inside of something because he was predictable and his hatred could be steered. Not the most gifted. Aurra Sing had the Force itself and a Jedi education and a marksman's patience. And she ended as a cautionary tale told by people who cannot agree on the details. Not the most audacious. Cad Bane took a government hostage in its own chamber and walked out through the front door. And his career lasted a handful of years. And he died in the dirt on a backwater world. Not the most relentless. IG-80. 8 never slept and never tired and never wavered. And it is scrap. Not the most durable. Bossk could grow back what he lost. And he spent the last stretch of his life taking orders from a man he had once mentored. Not the best. That title belonged to Jango Fett, by common agreement of everybody in the profession, and he was killed in an arena in front of his son at the height of his powers, because being the best in the world is not the same as being able to survive the world. Boba Fett was none of those things individually, and he outlasted every single one of them. And the reason is not complicated, and it is the answer to the question we started with. He finished. That was all. Over 60 years. Against Jedi and Sith and Imperial fleets and the New Republic and an army from outside the galaxy that could not be sensed or reasoned with, handed the hardest names in the profession and given no support and no forgiveness. He finished. Not always quickly, not always cleanly. But the outcome did not vary, and there is no other name in the history of the trade about which that can be said. He was dangerous because he was patient when patience was expensive. He was dangerous because he never once mistook a job for a grudge. And so he never made the mistake that killed almost everyone else in his profession. He was dangerous because he prepared obsessively for the day the equipment failed. And when that day came, it found him in the belly of a thing that had been digesting people since before civilization, and he came out of it and went back to work. He was dangerous because he could not be reached and could not be bought past the terms of a contract, and could not be provoked, and could not be predicted, and could not be made to care. And in the end, he was dangerous because he was the only one who was still standing, which is the only measure that has ever meant anything in that line of work. That is the argument. Take it or leave it. The galaxy took it in the end and stopped arguing about it a long time ago. There is one thread we have not pulled, and it is a large one. The armor. That plate came out of a culture with thousands of years of history behind it. A people who fought the Republic to a standstill and broke Jedi armies and shattered themselves and rebuilt and shattered again over and over, long before any of the names in tonight's story were born. The wars that forged that Beskar are stranger and bloodier than anything a bounty hunter ever did, and they are waiting for another night. For now, though, that is the whole of it. an orphan on his knees in an arena holding a helmet, an old man in a training yard, dying, teaching a Jedi how to win. Everything in between was just the work. The ship outlived him, incidentally. That ugly, unloved, endlessly modified patrol craft that a man once took off a body and gave to his son, that carried an orphan out of an arena and a frozen smuggler across half the galaxy and a dying old man home to a mining world at the end, was still flying long after the hand that first held its controls had gone still. It had been rebuilt so many times that almost nothing original remained in it, which is a fitting sort of monument for a man who did the same thing to himself over and over for 60 years and came out the other side as the last one standing. Sleep well.